Violence is erupting in Cuba as protesters torch Communist Party offices, throw rocks, and chant against the regime in a rare show of defiance.
2 days ago, the entire island of Cuba went dark. Not a neighborhood, not a city, the entire country. All 10 million people. No power at the same time. It lasted 29 hours. And here's the thing. This was not a freak accident. It was the third major nationwide blackout in just 4 months. This is not a story about communism. This is not about politics. This is about a country that has been running on empty for years and is now running out of road completely. And the reason it is happening right now, this week, comes down to one decision made in Washington in January. Let's get into it. It started with Venezuela. To understand Cuba in 2026, you need to understand one simple fact. Cuba produces almost no oil of its own. It needs imported fuel to run its power plants, its hospitals, its farms, its transport, everything. And for decades, the country that supplied that fuel was Venezuela, which sent Cuba tens of thousands of barrels of oil per day in exchange for Cuban doctors and advisors. That arrangement kept Cuba functional for over 2 decades. Then on January 3, 2026, U.S. forces went into Venezuela and removed President Nicolas Maduro from power. The resulting blockade of Venezuelan oil destined for Cuba left the island without adequate supply overnight. And then the U.S. went further. On January 29th, Trump signed an executive order declaring Cuba an extraordinary threat and imposed tariffs on any country that directly or indirectly supplies oil to Cuba. Mexico, which had stepped in as Cuba's backup supplier, was targeted directly with tariff threats. Mexico temporarily halted shipments within days. Cuba's president confirmed the island had not received oil shipments in 3 months and was operating on solar power, natural gas, and aging thermoelectric plants. According to ship tracking data, Cuba has received only 2 small vessels carrying oil imports this entire year. What no oil actually means. No oil does not just mean no fuel for cars. In Cuba, it means no electricity, no refrigeration, no running water in many areas, no functioning hospitals, no waste collection, no food transport. Most Cubans were already seeing 16 or more hours of blackout daily, even before the latest grid collapse. One Havana resident described it simply: it affects every aspect of our lives. Food, water, everything is in disarray. Cubans have described having brief bursts of electricity during which they race to cook, do laundry, and charge their devices, while food spoils in powerless refrigerators. Trash piles up on streets because fuel trucks cannot run, and the heat without electric fans has become unbearable. One woman said she was upset that food she buys with money her son in the U.S. sends keeps spoiling. Her 72-year-old mother suffers every day. Another resident said recently, everything goes bad. And it is not just food. Cuba's president confirmed the government has had to postpone surgeries for tens of thousands of people because of the fuel shortage. The economy was already broken. Now here's the important context. The oil blockade did not create Cuba's problems. It accelerated ones that were already years in the making. Cuba's power grid is built around obsolete Soviet-made thermal power plants that have been in use for decades. The country failed to invest in updating them and became entirely dependent on oil imports to keep them running. The thermoelectric plants have also been using heavy oil whose sulfur content is corroding the equipment, so the machines are literally being eaten from the inside. The economy has been shrinking for years. The currency has collapsed. The energy crisis has led to soaring inflation and surging food prices. And the number of people openly protesting, something extremely rare in Cuba, is rising fast. The number of protests increased from 30 in January to 130 in just the first half of March. In an unusual display of dissent, anti-government protesters attacked a Communist Party office in the central city of Morón on March 14th. That is not normal for Cuba. What the U.S. actually wants. So why is the U.S. doing this? What is the goal? The answer is not hidden. The United States is motivated by a desire for regime change in Cuba by the end of 2026. The Trump administration is demanding Cuba release political prisoners and move toward political and economic liberalization in return for lifting sanctions. And behind the scenes, the message is even clearer. The Trump administration is looking for Cuban President Díaz-Canel to leave power entirely as Washington continues to negotiate with Havana about the island's future. And then on Monday, The same day the entire island went dark, Trump stood in front of reporters and said this out loud. "You know, all my life, I've been hearing about United States and Cuba. Whether I free it, take it, I think I can do anything I want with it. They're a very weakened nation right now." Pressed on whether a U.S. operation in Cuba would mirror the capture of Maduro in Venezuela or look more like the ongoing military conflict with Iran, Trump said, "I can't tell you that." Cuba's president responded directly. Diaz-Canel wrote, "They intend to announce plans to take over the country, its resources, its properties, and even the very economy they seek to suffocate in order to force us to surrender." The Iran connection. And this is where the bigger picture comes in. The U.S. is currently fighting a war against Iran alongside Israel. Cuba has a strategic partnership with Iran. Both are under crushing U.S. pressure simultaneously. And Cuba watched what happened to Venezuela, where the U.S. simply went in and took the president. Analysts have warned that with Cuba's electricity grid teetering, events risk overtaking both the regime and Washington. The U.S. game plan for Cuba is unclear and could easily be dictated by fast-moving events rather than strategy. UN human rights experts condemned the U.S. fuel blockade on Cuba, calling it a serious violation of international law and an extreme form of unilateral economic coercion. The negotiations. Here is where things stand right now. Cuba and the U.S. have opened talks aimed at diffusing the crisis, among the most acute since 1959. Cuba's deputy prime minister announced that Cuban nationals living abroad, including in Miami, will be allowed to directly invest in Cuba and own businesses there. A pro-market reform that maps almost exactly onto what Trump has been repeatedly saying any deal would require. Cuba's president confirmed talks with the U.S., but warned that any agreement would likely take time. Meanwhile, Russia reaffirmed its commitment to helping Cuba amid the crisis. And a Hong Kong-flagged tanker that had suspended its course in the Atlantic resumed navigation toward Cuba, potentially carrying fuel. So there are small signs of movement. But the structural crisis does not go away, even if a deal is reached. Cuba has survived impossible situations before. The collapse of the Soviet Union, decades of embargo, hurricane after hurricane. But what is happening right now is different in one key way. The pressure is coming from every direction at once. An oil blockade, a collapsing grid, a shrinking economy, an aging population, a government being asked to essentially dismantle itself, and a U.S. president publicly discussing taking the country. Power has been partially restored after the 29-hour blackout, but officials warned that shortages will continue because not enough electricity is being generated. The lights came back on in Havana, but the crisis that caused them to go out in the first place, that is nowhere close to being over.